Hello, my name is Matthew DeVoli, and I'll be giving a presentation on the book Collaborative Governance Regimes by Kirk Emerson and Tina DeBacci. The reason I chose this book is because in my line of work in the Army, I not only have to collaborate between different units within the Army, but I need to collaborate with different branches in the military. And things get further muddled by the idea that there are different government contractors that are contracted out by various different organizations. And so I'm always looking forward to find ways to increase my ability to collaborate across different kinds of lines, basically. Also, I want to note real quickly that another reason I was interested in this book is because I served under 1/6 Infantry and I really love their slogan. I've tried to apply their slogan in my life as much as possible. That slogan being, unity is strength. I really do believe in that. I believe strength comes through unity. And I really like the idea that this book was trying to flesh out how to cultivate greater unity in order to create greater strength in organizations in order to get things done. Now, jumping into the problem that the book is trying to correct, that is that even though if the public at large could see a need for a particular thing to be done, build a building, fill in some potholes, so on and so forth, the friction from different individuals and different groups not seeing eye to eye can lead to conflict, which can lead to things basically not being done. So the book is concerned with how to get different individuals, different groups to work together to build a common goal, which will lead to creating a better society, basically. Let's discuss the problem a little bit more. So the authors laid out that while there's always been a need for collaboration, right now with conditions of the ground, there is need for even further collaboration in the sense that there are elaborate networks of indirect administrative approaches conducted by various organizations within the public, private, and non-private sectors. And because of this increased complexity, this Gordian knot that has been created over the years, there's a need to smooth out the friction points, basically. Also, briefly, as I'm sure anyone listening to this is well aware of, there's been increased vocalization in our country, increased polarization that leads to a lot of conflict, which leads to a lot of things not being done. And I'm sure that the authors would agree that their approach could help smooth that out as well. Now, another problem besides just the problem of things being complex and polarized, so on and so forth, another problem that the authors were trying to address in the book that they wrote about a decade ago is the idea that at the time, to their understanding, there was a lack of academic consensus of what really was meant by collaborative governments. That is, they bemoaned the fact that there was a lack of a good definition, a good framework, and they wrote the book part and parcel to try to correct this. So, in order to correct it, they gave a definition for collaborative governments. That is, the process and structures of public policy decision-making and management that enable people to engage across boundaries. They got more specific, given definition to what they called the collaborative governance regimes, kind of like the title of the book. That definition being a system for public decision-making in which cross-boundary collaboration represents the prevailing pattern of behavior and activity. Now, for this presentation, I'm going to focus more on the driver component that you see on this slide right here. But in order to give context to that, I'm going to briefly, and I promise briefly, go over the entire integrated framework of collaborative governance, which you can see right here starts with the drivers that get the engine going of collaborative governance regimes, that engine being the collaborative dynamics that are driven by the three pistons of principal engagement, joint capacity, and shared motivation. With the idea being that everything running smoothly, it would create an action, and that action would lead to outcomes, so on and so forth. And don't worry, I'll get a little bit more into that. Let's start with the driver. So again, I'll go into this more depth later in this presentation. But real quick, the drivers are the ones that really get things going. So they overcome uncertainty. They create interdependence with the various individuals and groups that they're trying to get to work together. And they do this in part by creating consequential incentives to have the people to continue to work with each other. And also, they do all this through initiating leadership. So this can be through an individual. This can be a group of individuals, a group of groups, but just somebody or some entity that really is that initiating spark that gets things going. And what they're trying to spark off, what they're trying to get going, is that engine, again, for collaborative dynamics. Let's discuss each one very quickly. So one of the three pistons is the idea of principal engagement. As you can see, it's in a circle. That represents that it is a feedback loop, and hopefully it's a positive feedback loop. Now for this, you can start pretty much anywhere, but let's start at discovery. So the discovery stage is basically they're discovering what the opportunities and the lack of opportunities they have, and how to, get things going. After that discovery stage, they then go to definition, where they refine terms. They refine what exactly they want to do. And with that refinement of terms, they can lead to deliberation, which is basically them talking through, hey, we define things, we have a general idea of like different things we're trying to do. Let's deliberate, let's have conversations, let's figure out how to actually do them, which leads to determinations. They determine what to do. And through their determination of what to do, that could lead to, more ideas being generated, which leads to more discovery, which leads to refinement of definition, refinement of deliberation, so on and so forth. Which leads us into the next piston. So they have a general idea of what they want to do, and so they can have commitment. They can have commitment to what they want to do. And by the different individuals, different groups showing that commitment, that can lead to trust. So everyone sees the commitment that everyone has, so they start trusting each other more. And with more trust being generated, that can lead to more mutual understanding of, hey, we're all on the same side. Let's get this together. I trust you, you trust me, and we all understand what we want to do together. And that in turn can create internal legitimacy within the organization. So they see themselves as more legitimate. They feel better about themselves, which leads to more commitment, so on and so forth. And that leads us into the third piston. And again, we can start pretty much anywhere, but let's just start with resources. So, they're all committed. They all have this trust, and so they're bringing these resources together that they have. And by bringing all these resources together, that creates knowledge of not only what kind of resources they actually have to bear, but also it creates some knowledge of how to actually use those resources. And in order to use the resources, that leads into the procedural and institutional arrangements of how to use those resources, which then can help confer power to various leaders within the group, given the institutional arrangements. And these leaders can help acquire more resources and direct how to use resources, which leads to generating greater knowledge of how to use resources, and so on and so forth. Now, while the maintenance of the engine is good, it's not the end goal, basically. The end goal is actually get things done, which are the actions. So let's say, for example, this whole thing was set up in order to fill some potholes in one particular road. Well, the action would be to go out and fill those potholes, which would lead to the outcome of the potholes being filled. At this point, they have two options. One option is to, as sad as it may seem, just disband the organization. Like the organization had a reason to exist. That reason no longer exists now because the potholes have been filled. And so they can pat each other on the back and say, hey, good job, guys. We did good. Another option is, as you can see on the slide, adaption. So they can adapt to changing circumstances in the sense that, yeah, the potholes are filled, but they can see other problems with the road. Or maybe they see some other roads that have potholes and they're like, hey, we did a pretty good job on that one road. Let's expand this. Let's adapt. Let's fill some other potholes. And so basically, that's the whole end game when it comes to this collaborative governance regime. Now, before focusing on the driver component, I promise I'll get to that soon enough. I do want to offer a minor critique, and this critique is set out of love. So I really like the book. I'd highly recommend it. But I would offer some caveats to it. One being that it may be a little too comprehensive. So in their quest to really define what collaborative governance is, there is a possibility, and some other scholars have pointed this out since the publication of the book, that different collaborative government regimes are basically so different from each other in the way that they're constructed, for their goals, so on and so forth, that it may be better to actually focus on different regimes differently, study them differently, and implement them differently. Now, I will give due credit to Emerson and DeBacci. They did bring this up in the book, and they did talk about some variations on the same themes. But it still stands to say that if you do get the book, and I do recommend you read the book, you need to take the recommendations with a tad bit of salt and try to really think through the book critically and how much you should use various recommendations for whatever conditions on the ground you see yourself in. Also, one more minor critique, and it is minor. Some scholars have pointed out that there's not enough focus on the idea of building public trust. Now, again, to their credit, they do discuss that a little bit in the book, but I do see some wisdom in the critique in the sense that the book is very focused on the idea of what happens internally within the collaborative governance regime, and there may not be enough focus on the idea of, bringing in the public, talking to them more, building that public trust. So again, if you do pick up the book, if you do try to implement some ideas in the book, just keep that in mind. But again, these are minor critiques. I just want to get them out of the way real quick. All right, let's move on to what I really want to talk about, the drivers. So why I really like the drivers is because while I was reading the book, it really reminded me of one of my favorite military theorists, that being Karl von Clausewitz, who the U.S. military actually has cited a lot and used a lot of his work to develop doctrine and general warrior ethos, basically. And I'm not going to read the whole quote, I promise, but I really like the part where he says, a powerful iron will overcomes this friction. Friction being, just things that happen that are out of your control. And it crushes the obstacles. And then, like an obelisk towards which the principal streets of a house converge, the strong will of a proud spirit stands predominant, commanding, in the middle of the art of war. I just love that guy. And again, the book, I think, really speaks to the idea of there needs to be somebody that overcomes this friction. Now, while Clausewitz was somebody who was first and foremost in my mind as I was reading the book, Glenn Arnold was another person who the book kind of reminded me of. So in the DPA program, and also while I was getting my master's degree, the idea of the policy entrepreneur came up over and over again in various readings from various professors. And I'm sure some of you watching this right now may be well aware of the idea of policy entrepreneurs. So I won't go too much in depth with it. But again, I really like this quote from her where she's saying that coalitions seeking policy change are more likely to be successful when they have skilled leadership. Now, what is it meant to have skilled leadership? Well, that leads us into what Emerson and DeBacci talked about, the 4 elements of the driver. The first element being overcoming uncertainty. So basically creating a common consensus over uncertain goals. Simple enough. Don't feel the need to explain that much further. I think that speaks for itself. Next is the interdependence. So even though there's consensus over uncertain goals, there's still a need to acknowledge the need for and the value of various individuals and various members of the group. I mean, if various individuals working together don't see the value in each other, how are they going to really get things done? Well, the answer to that is probably not that well. So there really is a need to build acknowledgement of the value of different groups, different individuals, and the driver is the force that builds that acknowledgement. But they cannot operate just on that. They need to have incentives, of course, So the driver needs to clarify the consequential incentives for the individuals and groups to work together, carrots and sticks, so on and so forth. And all this is in line with the idea of initiating leadership. So it could just be one individual, it could be a group of individuals, it could be a group, doesn't really matter. Whatever individual or group of people or entities are the spark that set things off, there just has to be somebody or something that really gets things going. That's what's meant for initiating leadership. All right, to discuss this in further detail, let's move on to our case study. The case study comes from one of my favorite books, actually, The Ragged Edge. So, I'm assuming a lot of people watching this may be well aware of it, but sometimes people forget the wars that we fight. So, a brief little synopsis of it is: we invaded Iraq, we disbanded the government, we disbanded the civil service, we disbanded the military, and chaos erupted, basically. And then the idea came like, hey, we should probably, help them create a government and help them create a military so they can kind of not live in absolute chaos and squalor. So that's where Michael Saki comes into play. He was assigned to actually, from scratch, build a military unit in Iraq. And this book discusses his adventures and misadventures to do that. So how does that book apply to the Emerson and Nabachi reading? Well, I think it applies very, very well, actually. So the book discusses uncertainty. It discusses the distrust between the Iraqis and the Americans, and the distrust between various groups of Iraqis. They have the Sunnis, you have the Shiites, you have the Kurds, and you have various other religious organizations and various other ethnic groups that I actually never heard of until I read the book. Again, this is a good book. You should read it. And all this distrust was within the context of the chaos of the violence of insurgency, sectarian violence, random terrorists, both in Iraq and non-Iraqis coming in Iraq and causing trouble. So a lot of uncertainty was going on at the time. And the driver, again, Saki, one of the main things he had to do was build a consensus with the ragtag group of people he was throwing together to create this new Iraqi army, create this consensus on the goal of a stable Iraq. And he did this in part through the idea of the interdependence, again, following the whole driver framework. And he did this through having them acknowledge the need to work together for the big picture of Iraqi stability. Basically, yeah, your country's not really doing that well right now. Let's make Iraq great again. So the book discussed how he was able to have them acknowledge that, and that really helped build the group together. And not just the big picture, but also acknowledge the need to work together for the individual survival of the people, basically, so they won't get killed. And that leads us to the consequential incentives that the driver is initiating, basically. So the book discusses how he was able to create consensus on the consequences of disunity, basically point out, hey, like, you may not necessarily agree religious wise, or you may have ethnic and tribal squabbles. I get you, but you need to rely on the guy to your left or right, or else you're going to get killed. So the book kind of discussed that. And also, not just that as a disincentive, but also the further disincentive of understanding if there's failure, well, people are going to get relieved of the duty, including himself, and also the people that he disseminated authority to within the group as it was getting going. And that leads us to the initiating leadership component. And for this scenario, it was more of a top-down approach where Saki was basically told one day, hey, you're going to go make this unit from scratch from all these people that hate each other. Good luck. And so that was the initiating spark for his thing, and then which led to him giving subsequent dissemination to authority to others. That leads us into the case study questions. So I do want to point out the book leaves on a bitter note where things kind of broke down after he left, which leads to the question. Given that things broke down after he left command, how do you think that a person that acts as a singular leader can prevent a breakdown after he leaves? Also, the book outlined how there was a lot of problems. I gave a little rosy picture of the previous slide of how you got that consensus, but there was just some individuals and some groups that were just not working well with each other. So given that a lot of friction was caused through incorporating several groups that had rivalry and distrust, at what point should individuals and groups not be included in an organization? And then third, this is a general question. How would you navigate setting up an organization from scratch that would need to work through ethnic, religious, national, or whatever differences? And that concludes my presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. You have a good day.